In the small town of Madison, Ohio, a crime occurred in March 2018 that shocked the local community. On the evening of March 15th, 18-year-old Daniel Reynolds murdered his father, 42-year-old Robert Reynolds, in their home. The murder was the culmination of a complex and painful relationship between father and son, rooted in Robert's sexual obsession with his son. This story, based on police reports, court records, and witness testimony, reveals the tragic circumstances that led to irreversible damage. Madison is a typical American town with a population of about 3,000 people. Everyone knew each other here, and the Reynolds family was considered one of many leading a quiet and unremarkable life. Robert Reynolds worked as a mechanic at a local workshop, and his son Daniel was a senior in high school. Neighbors described them as reserved, but not suspicious. No one could have guessed that behind the closed doors of their home, a drama was unfolding that would end in murder. Robert Reynolds became a widower in 2010 when his wife Elizabeth died of cancer. Since then, he has been raising Daniel alone. At first, their relationship seemed normal. The father took care of his son, provided for him, monitored his progress in school. However, over time, Robert's behavior began to change. He became overprotective of Daniel, limiting his communication with friends and interfering in his personal life. These changes went unnoticed by most, but gradually became a cause of tension in the family. By 2016, when Daniel was 16, Robert began to show an unhealthy interest in his son. Neighbors noticed that he often followed Daniel, followed him everywhere, and did not allow him to spend time with other teenagers. At school, teachers noted that Daniel had become silent and distant, but no one suspected the true reason for his behavior. Later, the investigation will find Robert's diaries in which he described in detail his feelings for his son, going beyond the boundaries of parental care. These entries will become key evidence in the investigation. As a teenager, Daniel found himself in a situation he couldn't handle. He tried to resist his father's pressure, but this led to conflicts. Robert responded to his son's attempts to set boundaries with aggression and threats. In 2017, the tension in the house reached its limit. Daniel began looking for ways to get out from under his father's control, but his isolation and fear prevented him from seeking help. The school psychologist he once spoke to didn't get the full picture of what was happening, as Daniel was afraid to reveal the truth. On March 15, 2018, the conflict between father and son reached a tragic conclusion. That evening, Daniel, in a state of extreme emotional stress, took a kitchen knife and stabbed his father several times. Robert died at the scene. A neighbor, hearing screams, called the police. The officers arrived and found Daniel in the house next to his father's body. He did not try to escape and immediately confessed to what he had done, but his explanations were confused and full of contradictions. The investigation that followed the murder revealed shocking details about the Reynolds family. Robert's diaries, his correspondence with his son, and neighbors' testimonies helped investigators piece together the events. The trial, which began in September 2018, attracted public attention. Daniel's lawyers argued that he acted under the influence of long-term psychological and sexual abuse at the hands of his father. The prosecution insisted on premeditated murder. The story raises difficult questions about how psychological abuse can go undetected within families, and the role that social institutions play in preventing such tragedies. The Reynolds case is not only a chronicle of a crime, but also a reminder of the importance of recognizing the signs of trouble. The Reynolds family lived in Madison, Ohio, on a quiet street where houses were close together and neighbors knew most of each other's lives. Robert Reynolds, 42, was an auto mechanic at a small shop on the outskirts of town. He was considered a hard worker but a taciturn man. After the death of his wife, Elizabeth, in 2010, he was left as the sole caretaker of his son, Daniel, then 10. Elizabeth died of pancreatic cancer, and her death was a heavy blow to the family. Neighbors recalled that Robert became even more withdrawn after that, focusing all his attention on raising his son. Daniel grew up as a quiet child. In elementary school, he did well in school, played baseball, and was friends with the kids in the neighborhood. Teachers described him as polite and diligent, although a little shy. After his mother died, his behavior began to change. He became less sociable, participated in school activities less often, and almost stopped inviting friends over. Neighbors noticed that Robert did not encourage his son to interact with other children, but no one paid much attention to this, believing that his father was simply overprotective of his son after the loss of his wife. The Reynolds house was modest, one story, with a small backyard. Neighbors rarely saw anything out of the ordinary happen there. Robert kept the house in order, mowed the lawn regularly, and paid the bills. His work schedule was stable. From 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., he worked on cars and came home in the evening. Daniel usually stayed home after school, doing homework or watching television. According to neighbor Margaret Wilson, Robert sometimes picked up his son from school himself, even after Daniel was old enough to walk home on his own. By 2014, when Daniel was 14, some people began to notice strange behavior in Robert. He began talking about his son more often, praising his looks and academic achievements, but in an obsessive manner. One of Robert's co-workers, James Clark, later told police that Robert once showed him a photo of Daniel in a swimsuit by a lake and talked at length about how handsome his son was. Clark didn't think much of it at the time, but he recalled the conversation during the investigation. At school, Daniel continued to study, but his performance gradually declined. Teachers noted that he began skipping physical education classes and avoiding school activities such as sports competitions and dances. The school counselor, Ms. Andrews, tried to talk to Daniel in 2015 when she noticed he was depressed, but he refused to discuss his problems. She contacted Robert, who assured her that everything was fine at home and asked her not to interfere. Neighbors also began to notice that Daniel rarely left the house except for school. His elementary school friends, with whom he used to hang out, stopped coming over. One of them, Thomas Brown, later said that Robert once abruptly banned him from their house without explanation. By 2016, Daniel had little contact with his peers, spending all his free time with his father. Robert, for his part, seemed content with the way things were. He didn't seek out new relationships after his wife's death, nor did he make any close friends. His life revolved around his work and his son. His neighbors rarely saw him in public places, such as the local bar or church. The only exceptions were trips with Daniel to the lake, where they sometimes fished. These trips, it later turned out, were some of the few times Robert and Daniel were seen together in public. By 2016, the seemingly stable life of the Reynolds family began to show cracks. Daniel, who was 16, began arguing with his father more often, although the arguments took place behind closed doors. Neighbors sometimes heard loud voices, but did not intervene, considering it normal family disagreements. No one suspected that a tragedy was brewing in the Reynolds house, which in 2 years would lead to irreversible consequences. By 2016, when Daniel Reynolds was 16, his father Robert's behavior had become a concern to those around him. Daniel's physical description, as recorded in school records, indicated that he was of average height, thin, with dark hair and pale skin. He did not stand out among his peers, but Robert, according to witnesses, began to focus on his son's appearance. Neighbor Margaret Wilson recalled that Robert once showed her a photo of Daniel taken during a trip to the lake and spoke at length about how his son had grown up and looked like his mother. Margaret did not attach any importance to this at the time, but her testimony later became part of the investigation. Robert became overly controlling of Daniel's life. He forbade his son from staying after school for extracurricular activities, such as the school's drama club or sports teams. The physical education teacher, Mr. Harris, noticed that Daniel had stopped participating in team sports, citing his father's orders. Robert personally called the school and asked that Daniel be excused from certain activities, citing family reasons. The school administration saw no reason to worry, since Robert was the sole guardian and had the authority to make such decisions. Around this time, Daniel began to avoid interacting with his peers. His former friend, Thomas Brown, told police that in 2016, Daniel stopped responding to texts and avoided hanging out. One day, when Thomas came to their house, Robert opened the door and said Daniel was busy before closing the door. Thomas no longer tried to contact his friend. Other classmates confirmed that Daniel became quiet, often sat alone during recess, and rarely looked up during conversations. Investigators later discovered Robert's diaries, which he had been keeping since 2015. In them, he described his feelings for Daniel, which went beyond parental affection. The entries began with the usual notes about his son's life, his success at school, his habits, his favorite films. However, by 2016, the tone had changed. Robert wrote about Daniel becoming an adult and described his appearance and behavior in detail. In one entry, dated August 2016, he mentioned that he can't take his eyes off him. The diaries, seized by police after the murder, contained more than 200 pages dedicated to Daniel. Robert also began to limit Daniel's access to the outside world. He took away his son's cell phone, saying that the internet was distracting from school. Daniel was only allowed to use the computer for schoolwork, and Robert checked his browser history. Neighbors noticed that Daniel rarely left the house except for school. One neighbor, John Carter, said he once saw Robert yell at Daniel in the yard when he tried to go for a walk without permission. At school, teachers began to notice changes in Daniel's behavior. He began skipping classes, citing poor health, although he did not provide medical certificates. The school counselor, Ms. Andrews, tried to talk to him in October 2016, but Daniel said he was fine and refused to meet again. Ms. Andrews contacted Robert, who assured her that he was monitoring his son and keeping things under control. The counselor had no reason to escalate the case, as Daniel had not reported abuse or threats. By the end of 2016, Robert had become even more clingy. He began accompanying Daniel to school and picking him up after school, even though the school was a 10-minute walk from the house. Neighbors noticed that Robert would often stand at the window, watching the street as Daniel walked home. One of Robert's co-workers, James Clark, recalled Robert once saying, "Daniel is all I have." Clark took it as a sign of fatherly affection, but later realized that the words had a different connotation. Daniel, for his part, became increasingly withdrawn. His grades dropped, and he stopped participating in school activities. Teachers noticed that he looked tired and depressed, but no one suspected what was going on in the Reynolds household. Robert successfully maintained the image of a caring father, and his eccentricities were attributed to loneliness after the death of his wife. No one could have guessed that his obsession with his son had already begun to ruin Daniel's life. By 2017, the relationship between Robert and Daniel Reynolds had reached a point where the tension in their home was obvious even to outsiders. Daniel was 17 and a senior at Madison High School, but his life was increasingly isolated. Robert, whose obsession with his son continued to escalate, became even more controlling and aggressive, responding to any attempts by Daniel to establish personal boundaries. This period marked a turning point, when the family's internal conflict began to spill out beyond the home. Neighbors began hearing more frequent screams coming from the Reynolds home. Margaret Wilson, who lived across the street, told police that she heard loud arguments late at night on several occasions in early 2017. She couldn't make out the words, but she noticed that Robert sounded angry and Daniel responded quietly or silently. Margaret once saw Daniel run out of the house, but Robert caught up with him at the gate and forced him back inside. She didn't intervene, thinking it was a family matter, but later regretted her inaction. At school, Daniel's behavior became even more alarming. Teachers noted that he often appeared exhausted, sometimes fell asleep in class, and barely interacted with his classmates. His grades dropped, especially in classes that required active participation, such as English and history. His English teacher, Mrs. Thompson, recalled that Daniel stopped doing his homework and avoided verbal responses. She tried to talk to him, but he responded in monosyllables and avoided eye contact. Mrs. Thompson reported her observations to the school counselor, Ms. Andrews. In March 2017, Ms. Andrews arranged a meeting with Daniel. During the conversation, he admitted that there were issues at home, but did not elaborate. He mentioned that his father was demanding too much, but denied physical abuse. Ms. Andrews suggested that he contact teen support services, but Daniel declined, saying it would only make things worse. She contacted Robert, who said his son was going through teenage rebellion and that he would sort it out himself. The counselor recorded the conversation in a report, but did not refer the matter to social services because she had no concrete evidence of abuse. Robert tightened his grip on his son during this time. He banned Daniel from social media and confiscated his laptop, leaving him with only an old phone with no internet access. Neighbor John Carter noticed that Robert had installed a lock on the front door that could only be opened with a key, even from the inside. Daniel stopped leaving the house without his father, except for school. When he tried to leave on his own, Robert responded with anger. One such incident occurred in May 2017, when a neighbor saw Robert yelling at Daniel in the yard, accusing him of being ungrateful. Robert's journals, later seized by police, show that in 2017, his obsession reached a new stage. He began writing about his fantasies surrounding Daniel, describing him in intimate detail. In one entry, dated April 2017, he mentioned that he can't let Daniel go. The entries also contained threats. Robert wrote that he would punish his son if he continued to push him away. Although there was no evidence of physical sexual abuse, the entries indicated intense psychological pressure. Daniel, for his part, tried to resist. According to a school friend, Chris Davis, with whom Daniel occasionally spoke, He once said that he wanted to leave home, but was afraid that his father would do something bad. Chris did not understand what he was talking about and did not ask. Daniel also tried to find a job for the summer of 2017 to save money to leave after school, but Robert forbade him from working, saying that he had to focus on school. By late 2017, the situation at home had become unbearable. Neighbors noticed that Daniel seemed increasingly depressed. One, Michael Reed, said he saw Daniel sitting on the porch in November 2017, staring into space, until Robert called him back inside. The arguments became more frequent, and some neighbors began to suspect that something serious was going on in the family, but no one dared to intervene. Robert continued to maintain the image of a strict but caring father, and his explanations about teenage problems seemed plausible. On the evening of March 15, 2018, a murder occurred in the Reynolds home in Madison, Ohio. Daniel Reynolds, who had recently turned 18, killed his father, Robert Reynolds, by stabbing him multiple times. Police arrived at the crime scene after a neighbor called and heard screams. The events of that night, reconstructed from the crime scene report, Daniel's testimony, and neighbors' accounts, became the key moment in this tragic story. According to the police report, the incident occurred around 9:30 p.m. Neighbor John Carter, who lived 2 doors down, reported hearing loud screams coming from the Reynolds home. He initially thought it was another argument, but the screams continued and he decided to call the police. A police patrol arrived at the scene at 9:47 p.m. Officers found the front door ajar and entered the house, where they found the body of Robert Reynolds in the living room. He was lying on the floor in a pool of blood, with multiple stab wounds to the chest and neck. Near the body was a kitchen knife, which was later identified as the murder weapon. Daniel was in his room in the house when police entered. He made no attempt to escape and immediately came out to the officers with his hands up. His clothes were stained with blood and his hands were shaking. When an officer asked what had happened, Daniel replied, "I killed him." His voice, according to police, was quiet and emotionless. The officers detained Daniel and took him to the station for questioning. A crime scene investigation team worked at the scene and collected evidence, including the knife, Daniel's clothes, and blood samples. An examination of the crime scene revealed that the murder had taken place in the living room. There were signs of a struggle on the floor and furniture, an overturned chair, a broken glass vase, and blood stains on the carpet. The forensic examination determined that Robert had been stabbed 7 times, 3 of which were fatal. The wounds indicated that the blows had been delivered with force, but unevenly, indicating that the attacker was in a state of affect. The time of death was determined to be between 9:20 and 9:30 p.m. During his initial interview on the night of the murder, Daniel gave a confused statement. He confirmed that he had taken a knife from the kitchen and stabbed his father, but could not clearly explain what led up to this. He mentioned that his father started screaming again and was coming towards him, but did not specify whether there was a direct threat. Daniel appeared confused, often falling silent and looking at the floor. Police noted that he showed no signs of aggression or resistance, but seemed emotionally drained. The interview was cut short as Daniel required medical attention for severe tremors and high blood pressure. Neighbors interviewed that night confirmed hearing screams. Margaret Wilson said she saw lights in the Reynolds living room and shadows moving behind the curtains about 10 minutes before police arrived. She couldn't say exactly what was happening, but she said the screams were unusually loud. Another neighbor, Michael Reed, said he heard Robert yell something like, "You can't do this to me," but wasn't sure of the exact words. The investigation team seized several items from the house that later became evidence. Among them were Robert's diaries, found in his bedroom, and Daniel's old mobile phone, which was kept in Robert's desk drawer. Several unsent messages were found on the phone, addressed to Daniel's school friend, Chris Davis. In one, dated February 2018, Daniel wrote, "I can't take it anymore. He's making me lose my life." The message was not sent because the phone did not have an active SIM card. Police also searched the house for other evidence. In Daniel's room, they found his school notebooks, in which he sometimes wrote notes unrelated to school. One entry, dated January 2018, read, "I don't know how to get out." These findings, while not direct evidence, helped investigators understand Daniel's mental state in the months leading up to the murder. By the morning of March 16th, Daniel had been formally charged with murder. He remained in custody, awaiting his first court hearing. The events of that night became the starting point for an investigation that would reveal the complex and painful history of the Reynolds family. Following the murder of Robert Reynolds on March 15, 2018, Madison police launched an investigation that uncovered shocking details about the family's life. Daniel Reynolds, who was arrested at the scene, was charged with first-degree murder. The trial, which began in September 2018, attracted the attention of local media and residents as the case addressed complex issues of psychological abuse and family relationships. The investigation and trial were key steps in establishing the truth. Police began by searching the Reynolds home and interviewing witnesses. Robert's diaries, found in his bedroom, became the central piece of evidence. They contained 3 years of entries in which Robert described his obsession with Daniel. The entries included detailed descriptions of his son's appearance, habits, and behavior, as well as fantasies that crossed the boundaries of normal parental feelings. In the 2017 entries, Robert mentioned threatening Daniel if he continued to resist. Forensic analysis confirmed that the diaries were Robert's, as the handwriting matched his signature on work documents. Investigators also examined Daniel's phone, which was seized from Robert's locker. It contained unsent messages in which Daniel expressed frustration and fear of his father. One message, dated January 2018, read, "He follows me all the time. I can't leave." These messages, although unsent, indicated the psychological pressure Daniel was under. Police interviewed Daniel's high school friend, Chris Davis, who confirmed that Daniel had mentioned problems with his father, but did not elaborate. Robert's neighbors and co-workers provided additional evidence. Margaret Wilson described arguments she had heard in recent months and how Robert had restricted Daniel's movements. Robert's co-worker, James Clark, recalled his obsessive comments about his son's appearance. A school counselor, Ms. Andrews, reported meeting Daniel in 2017, where he mentioned problems at home but refused help. These accounts helped investigators understand that Daniel was under intense psychological pressure. A psychological evaluation conducted in April 2018 found that Daniel suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, which was caused by long-term psychological abuse. Psychiatrist Dr. Linda Morgan noted that Daniel exhibited symptoms of chronic fear and depression, common in victims of abusive relationships. She concluded that his actions on the night of the murder could have been the result of cumulative stress and hopelessness. However, the evaluation found no evidence of physical sexual abuse, which was a point of contention at trial. The trial began on September 10, 2018, in Madison County Court. Prosecutors argued that Daniel committed premeditated murder, citing the number of stab wounds and the lack of an immediate threat from Robert at the time of the attack. The prosecutor, David Lawson, argued that Daniel could have left the house or sought help instead of resorting to violence. The prosecution emphasized that Daniel failed to call the police after the murder and did not attempt to provide first aid to his father. Defense attorneys, on the other hand, focused on psychological abuse. They presented Robert's journals as evidence of his obsession and threats against his son. Defense attorney Sarah Bennett argued that Daniel was acting under extreme emotional stress, the result of years of control and intimidation. She called Dr. Morgan to the stand, who testified that Daniel was in a state of near panic on the night of the murder. The defense also relied on testimony from neighbors and a school counselor to show how his father's isolation and pressure limited Daniel's ability to seek help. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Daniel testified, describing how his father had yelled at him that night and threatened to never let him go. He admitted to picking up the knife to intimidate Robert, but lost control as his father approached. His testimony was emotional but coherent, which swayed the jury. On October 3, 2018, the jury found Daniel guilty of manslaughter rather than first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to 7 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 4 years. Daniel Reynolds' sentencing on October 3, 2018, brought the trial to a close, but left many questions unanswered. Daniel was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to 7 years in prison with the possibility of parole. He began serving his sentence at the Ohio Correctional Facility, where he was given access to mental health services. The Reynolds case has sparked discussions in Madison about how mental abuse can go undetected and what measures are needed to protect victims. The community was divided. Some residents thought the sentence was too lenient, pointing to the brutality of the murder. Others sympathized with Daniel, seeing him as a victim of prolonged pressure. The local newspaper published an article emphasizing that the school and social services had failed to notice the signs of trouble in time. The school counselor, Ms. Andrews, later admitted that she regretted not being persistent enough in talking to Daniel. The case also drew attention to the problem of psychological abuse in families. Experts noted that such cases are difficult to detect, since victims often remain silent out of fear or shame. Robert's diaries became an example of how unhealthy feelings can develop covertly without arousing suspicion in others. Public meetings were held in Madison to discuss measures to improve the work of school psychologists and social services. For Daniel, the sentence was both a punishment and a chance for recovery. A psychiatrist who treated him in prison said he began therapy to cope with the trauma. The Reynolds story was a reminder that early intervention could have prevented tragedy, and it underscored the importance of paying attention to signs of trouble in families.